Well, good morning. Welcome to Debbie's Back Porch. So glad to have you with us. Last night I made some bread, and I made English bloomer bread. And no, it doesn't have anything to do with bloomers. Here are your ingredients. You can pause and write them down. And hey, while you're paused, I'd love it if you would give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. And if you click the little bell at the top right, you'll get a notice when I post new videos about twice a week. Now let's bake some bread. Let's go over the ingredients, then I'll tell you why it's called bloomer bread. This is 2 ounces of olive oil. You can use 2 ounces of butter. And it's actually 1 cup of water warm and 1/4 cup whey, but you can use totally 1 1/4 cups water. I have here some Splenda, just a little bit, about a tablespoonful. And I have salt, about a tablespoonful. And I have yeast, and this is instant yeast, about a tablespoonful. And this is a very salty bread. You may want to use half that much. We like it salty, but not everybody likes that much salt. And that was 1 1/2 tablespoons full of Splenda, and you can use sugar, but it works just fine with Splenda. Now we're going to weigh our flour, and if you don't weigh your flour, you should. But if you do weigh your flour, it's 500 grams, and if you don't, it's about 3 cups, but that's never exact. So if you can weigh it, that's better. When you're using volume instead of weight, it can vary based on the weather and many things. So if you weigh it, you're going to get a more exact amount. If you measure with a cup, we may have to adjust. If you use active dry yeast, 1 packet is enough. Just put it in the water and we'll let it bloom a little bit before we start. I'm using instant yeast. I get SAF red instant yeast and buy it by the pound, and you don't have to do this proofing step. But I'm going to show it to you just in case. We'll wait about 5 minutes, and it should start to foam and bloom for active dry yeast. And let me show you this. I keep a spray bottle of just plain water, and we're going to use this a little bit later. So I'm going to use my KitchenAid today, but you can very easily mix this by hand. Here is my yeast. I actually didn't wait the 5 minutes because I don't need to. But if you're using the little packet, you want to wait 5 to 10 minutes until it starts to get foamy. I've mixed my dry ingredients together. If you were doing this by hand, you would then make a well in the middle of the dry ingredients and slowly mix the liquids in. I'm doing it just the opposite. And by hand, I mean by hand. I mean you put your hand in it and you mix it just like you would biscuits. But I've got my liquid in here first, the water and the yeast, and I'm going to put about half of the dry ingredients in. And I'm using the paddle, you can see, instead of the dough hook. I'll use the dough hook later. I'm using the mixer today because I have arthritis in my hands. Many people do have arthritis in their hands, and it's just easier with the mixer. If you want to mix it by hand because you don't have a mixer, then that is the normal way to make this particular bread. It's a fairly easy bread, can be mixed by hand. Now, usually when you're making bread in a mixer like this, you would start with the dough hook. But I just found with this kind of shaggy batter, shaggy dough, it's really easier if you use the paddle to get all the ingredients together. And then I'll slide the dough hook in, and I'll use that for the kneading. Now I've got that started. I'm going to pour the oil in. If you're using melted butter, that would be a half a stick. And you can use vegetable oil. You don't have to use olive oil, but it does bring a flavor. So either that or butter is what I recommend. So I'm going to let that mix up, and then I'm going to start adding the flour a little bit at a time. Now what we're going for here is a very smooth, very moist or hydrated dough. So I've got all my flour in. I'm switching over to the dough hook. If you measured it by cups, we might have to adjust just a little bit. Most likely you would need just a little bit more flour. If you weighed it, It's going to be much more exact. We're just going to mix this until all the flour is picked up into the ball and the sides pull clean. You can see that. Once we get to this point, we're going to set the timer for 10 minutes and knead this for 10 minutes. And that 10 minutes is the reason I used the mixer. I just wasn't up for 10 minutes of kneading. I have other videos that show you how to hand knead if you want to look. I'll post a link at the end to one that shows you a kneading procedure. So now we're going to do what we call the window pane test, and that's we're going to check this dough to make sure it's elastic enough. And I just pinched off a little piece, and well, let me put it back in the frame. And you want to see if the dough will stretch out until you can see light through it. And if it tears before it stretches that much, knead it another minute. Now I'm going to take this out and form it. And unlike most bread, you don't put flour on your board. Just rub just a tiny bit of the olive oil on your board and then form this into a ball. And we're not going to use any flour in our kneading for this bread at all. We want it to stay very elastic, very hydrated, meaning lots of water content in it through the whole process. So I make it into a ball and I swirl it around and around to try to smooth off the bottom. And then we're going to let this proof. And I promised at the beginning I was going to tell you why this is called bloomer bread. And now's the time. Put a little oil down in here. I'm going to put it in and flip it over. And we're going to let it rise for a long time because bloomer means the bread will bloom up without a pan. This bread doesn't get cooked in a loaf pan. It just gets cooked on a flat surface. I'm going to oil both sides. And we're going to work it and create enough surface tension that it blooms upward instead of outward. Be back in about an hour and a half. This is a very slow rise bread. It took an hour and a half to double in size. Very elastic. See, I poke my finger in and the dough does not rush back in to fill up the hole. So it's ready to go. I'm going to turn it out here onto my glass board, whatever surface you're using. It has plenty of olive oil on it still. And what I'm going to do at this point, well, I'll put another couple of drops on here because I just don't want it to stick to my board. I don't think it would. It's very, very elastic and firm. So I'll spread a little oil out and we're going to stretch this. 4, 5, 6 times, just pull it and stretch it. And look at that. Looks like bubble gum, doesn't it? I call this bubble gum dough. So just work with it a little bit and stretch it a few times. And when we've done that, we're going to form it back into a ball. Because yes, we're going to wait a little bit longer before we make our loaf. This very elastic type dough often just needs to rest a little bit after the rise. And I just knocked the air out of it. And I'm putting it back in a ball. And I'm going to put it back in my proofing bowl. And just let it rest for about 15 or 20 minutes. And more gluten will form. And it will just get more and more firm. And don't skip this step. You do want to let it rest a little bit. Because all of this kneading and working with this dough is about making the gluten strong so that it will rise upward and hold itself into a nice firm loaf without using a pan. Now I will tell you this works just great in a Dutch oven. If you want to cook this in a Dutch oven, it'll be just beautiful. It'll look more like an artisan loaf. But I want to show you how it will rise and stay firm. So we're going to put this back in just to rest. I'll cover it loosely. It may rise a little, but not much. What we're doing now is just letting the bread rest and strengthen. And after about 15 minutes of resting, we're going to turn this out and we're going to form our loaf. Now, I'm not using a rolling pin. You can. All I'm going to do at this point is sort of push this with my fingers into a rectangle. And it's very stretchy, and if you hadn't let it rest, it would be really hard to put this in a rectangle. It would just snap back. That resting period really helps you shape it into whatever shape you want. And I'm going to try to get it fairly uniform in its thickness. And then I'll turn it over, and this is the rougher side. I want the rougher side inside the fold. Just sort of going for a little bit of rough rectangle there. And then we're just going to start rolling it. And I'm going to kind of pinch it off after each roll. And that helps it stay together, helps it keep its form. Got bubbles there. We'll press those out as we go. And here at the end, I'm going to stretch it out just a little bit more, just to try to make the roll here smoother. Now, here is our fold where the ends meet. You want to pinch them pretty tightly. Now, I'm going to work with this a little bit, and all this rolling and stuff you see me do, it has a purpose. It's to build up the surface tension on this roll, which helps it stay very firm on the sides. I'm going to pinch this off here a little bit and fold it over. Because you don't want this to come undone as it's baking. You're helping it stay together and be uniform. The size that you make it really doesn't make that much difference. You can make it a little bit longer and thinner. I want it to be more like the shape of a loaf pan, because I'm going to cut this for sandwiches. You could also make a round ball for this and plop it in a Dutch oven and cook it without the lid in the oven. Now, I'm going to roll this, and this is to build surface tension. And I'm going to do this probably 4 or 5 times, and then turn it over and pinch again. And then roll it a little bit more and turn it over and pinch it again. And I want to shape this so that that seam goes right down the middle as closely as possible. And because of the texture of this bread, you may have to pinch it 3 or 4 times to make it stay together and uniform. And we don't have a lot of flour on the surface here. We don't have any flour on the surface here. And you just want to make that little seam in the middle. And I think we've just about got it here. I have a cast iron pan over here that I have oiled. You can use a cookie sheet and a piece of parchment paper if you want to. I like the cast iron because I want the bottom of the bread to be nice and crusty. There you go. I've just got it shaped, got it in the pan. You can cook it on anything. A cookie sheet works just fine. I'm going to cover this with a clean tea towel, and I'm going to let it rise for about maybe 30-45 minutes. You want it not quite to double in size, and this is a slow rise bread. This is after about 30 minutes. We just want it to be nice and puffy. Now you want to cut this along the top, and I'm going to make some fairly deep cuts. And the cuts along the top help it bloom up instead of out. If you don't cut it, it can just explode on the side. Okay, so now I'm spritzing it with water, just kind of misting it, and then we're going to cut 5, 6, 7 little slots across the top, about 1/4 inch deep. That's just going to help it, as I say, rise up. And you want to make sure that you cut them deep enough. See, the surface tension that we've built is going to pull it apart. That one needs a little more cutting. You can use a razor blade or a sharp knife. Then I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of flour across the top. That is absolutely optional. Makes it pretty, but you don't have to do it. While this was rising, I turned my oven on to 400 and it's preheated. You can put a pan in the bottom of your oven and add a cup of water to create steam in your oven. I'm actually just spraying the water directly into the oven. I've set my timer for 5 minutes. In 5 minutes, I'm going to do that again. Right now, that steaming helps the crust form and stay strong. We don't have steam ovens at home. Bakers cook this in a steam oven. Now bake it for 25 more minutes, and this is what you've got. If you check the internal temperature, it should be between 190 and 200. Now I'm going to take this out and put it on a rack to cool. You definitely don't want to cut this bread until it cools. Give it about 30 minutes. Now, you have a choice to make now. This crust will be very crusty and firm. If you want a softer crust, you want to butter it right now. Everything except the very top. I have a little melted butter and I'm going to just brush it on. And that makes just a wonderful sliced sandwich bread. It's all just your personal preference. I always like to butter the top of bread because it gives it that sort of chewy crust. You know the difference I mean? Either it crunches when you bite into it or it's a little chewy and ooh, don't you just love that? And I want to show you this bottom. You can see where that seam goes right down the middle. That helps it keep its shape and go up and not go kind of lopsided. Now when I get this all buttered, I'm going to wait about 30 minutes. I'm going to be good, I promise. And then I'm going to come back and slice this for you. I have a nice bread slicer, but this doesn't fit quite into it. So I'm just going to cut it free form. You might have to put a little extra pressure on that crispy crust on the bottom. And look at that beautiful crumb. This is very tender inside. And even though we worked really hard to make it firm on the outside, very tender inside. This makes wonderful French toast. It makes wonderful sandwiches. And oh yes, it makes a great bread pudding. If you have any left, I doubt you will. Let me put a little bit of butter on this, because you know that's the ultimate test. Just plain warm bread with a nice slather of butter on it. There's nothing better. Nothing says home more than warm bread with butter. Now I like my bread to have a little bounce back, just a tiny little bit of toughness that you feel with your teeth, and this is just like that. Very close in texture to French bread. We're going to have this for sandwiches tonight. I'll put the rest in a bag and it'll keep 2 or 3 days. It actually will stay soft longer than French bread does. You know, it gets hard pretty quickly. I hope you try this bread. If you've been wanting to learn to make bread, this is a good place to start. I hope you love it. And I hope to see you again tomorrow.